Hello? Hola? Hola? Este también. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Even though there are some people missing, we've been instructed to start. So without further ado, this is session 4A, which there's a very long. Yes. Okay. Good. We're going to be discussing the programs on development of indicator 4.1.1. There will be two presentations, one from Brenda, Tay-Lim. I'm very, very excited to introduce Brenda because we go way back. We worked together at UIS for 10 years, and we started on the very same day, actually. We both had the great idea of moving to Montreal in January, January 4th. And the other presentation is by Malcolm Cunningham from Carleton University, also in Canada. And the focus is on mapping existing mathematics learning assessments to the global content framework. And I think one very important point of what Brenda is going to do is to show how things are different at the national level and at the international level. There's a process. We need to think through this process of taking existing math assessments, some of them at the national level, and what they're used for, and how they are, developed, and how we intend to use them for a purpose that may be slightly different. And that requires rethinking a few things. And the other presentation is more focused on the specifics of mathematics. On the issue of what the countries are doing and what we are intending to do with the assessments, it's important then to take into account that these assessments, or the national assessments in particular, were not necessarily designed for comparability purposes, right? So it's important to make sure that as we make the decision to use information from national assessments, we don't interfere with the functions that those assessments are supposed to fulfill in their own environments, in their own countries. That is, I guess, the point that I was trying to make earlier that maybe didn't get across that clearly. It's not a question about the quality of assessments, is the issue of, well, when we start using an assessment for a different purpose than the one they were intended for, we may not achieve what we're trying to do at the global level, but also that may or may not have consequences at the national level. And that is something that we may want to avoid. So those were my 2 cents on that. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Brenda.
Thanks, Manuel. So one is enough. Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Manuel, for the introduction. So, in the morning you hear a lot about the system level and then also the process by our technical partner, the various process and activities.
Un poquito más cerca, gracias.
A bit closer. Okay. The different process, the things that we need to do in order to have global reporting. But before we go into that stage, we have to look at something else. I'm going to look at this in a smaller version. So I'm going to narrow down into just looking at the content framework and how we're going to use that eventually to link it back to the process that our technical partner is developing. So first, we'll start with the process of assessment and how this process of developing a national assessment translate into activities at a global level so that we can do global reporting. Okay. There is potentially 3 products that will come out from here, which is 1, content reference framework, then a mapping database, and a coding scheme. So each of it I will explain a bit more later. And the next step, how do we integrate the coding scheme into a bigger pictures of the validation process? Okay. The first thing, I think most of you are in learning assessment, so you know the assessment process. There are 5 important questions to ask when we want to establish an assessment. The who, the what, the how, the when, and the where. Okay, who meaning who do we want to measure? Who is our target population? The what is what are we going to measure? What domain are we going to cover? The how is the steps, the process, the data collections, the analysis. The when is, okay, when are we going to do it? Are we going to do it once a year or once in 2 years? And the where, are we collecting at school or at household? So, talking about this in general, so because now I'm going to concentrate more on the 4.1 because I think that is the most progress indicators. So we have, for example, we have issues on if there is country which they have big proportion of our school children, then are we going to use the information from in-school national assessment, or are we going to incorporate household-based survey? So those are some of the technical issues will come along the way when we look into generating data for global reporting. Okay, so looking at the first steps to define who and what. At the national assessment, the country will decide, the ministry will decide who they want to assess and what target population. In an education system, which they have a 6 years duration, they might want to assess them at midpoint, which is 3 years, or at the 6 years. So it all depends. That's how the country decide who they want to assess to know what their students know at that point of time. So to improve or to improve the curriculum or teachers' trainings or whatever system level. And another thing is, what do they want to measure? Of course, many countries, they have different assessment. I think most countries assess math and reading, but of course not all. And what UIS and IBE have been doing in the past month, we realized that by looking at a different assessment framework, that the definition of the domain might not all mean the same thing, or they don't always use the same terminologies. So translate this point into a global level, that means we need to define what we mean by a domain and what each of the domain. For example, in math, there's number operation, there's statistics and probabilities, and there's algebra. So are they all mean the same thing by all countries who develop their own or establish their own national assessment? So the first point for us probably to think through is we need common definition, common language, common definition, and common terminologies. Then the next step is the design. Once we establish at the country level, once the ministry establish what they're going to measure or the domain they're going to measure, then they usually use that as a framework or a blueprint to develop items to create a test. Okay, so at the global level, for example, 4.1.1, we know that many countries have conducted assessment in math and readings. So one first initial step is probably to look at the mapping, to see what kind of content is covered by all this national assessment. Is there gaps? Are they measuring the same thing? Are they measuring the learning as the same thing? Once we define have the defined definitions. And this mapping we are doing it now, ongoing with IBE. With that, it comes to, usually national assessment, sometimes they develop questionnaires. Background questionnaires to understand who they are assessing. What kind of background this student have? Are they belonging to they live in rural area? Are they belonging to the lowest socio-economic status? So that touch upon the equity dimension. So at global level, of course, we all know that if country develop national assessment, some country who have the capacity, they also define their classification variables well, and the SES and the location, they have the definition of the defined well ahead of time. But this definition might not apply the same across country. So at global level, maybe that is some of the definition that we need to also align, so that we when in the international education community, when we talk about student from rural area or student with a low SES, low income, we are talking about similar thing or same thing. And the fourth point is administrating the national assessment. Of course, once the test is developed, background questionnaires has been developed, the time is to administer the test. But we also noticed that in 4.1.1, many countries have different type of capacity. So they administer the test differently. They might do scoring, double scoring. They might give a test which is a paper pencil. They might have a computer-based test and it's computer scoring. So countries come in with different area or varies widely in terms of their capacity in how they administer or conduct national assessment. This translates into at the global level is now we have this issue that if we're going to use national level data to report on 4.1.1, then we need to look into the definition of qualities. We have to look into the assessment of the quality of all these assessments coming in. We need to set a minimum standard that whatever data come in order to produce a report, the global reporting, they must meet a certain standard like what Ursula mentioned this morning. There will be steps on aligning content, evaluating data collection process. The last point is defining reporting metrics. Most countries, when they develop national assessment, they also define how they're going to report, either by average score or creating performance levels so that they can describe the students that they want to report on to the policymakers, because not all policymakers understand what is the average score. So, then maybe a way to explain to them what are students with a certain who can do some simple computation, what is their achievement is, by giving a descriptive sense of what is minimum levels of achievement. And of course, when this translates into the global level, that means because in 4.1.1 there are so many different very national assessment, then when you translate to a national global levels, then we need to have a reporting scale so that we can map the national assessment data onto the reporting scale and help us understand the progression of the students' learning over time. So, of course, then in order to have the description of the performance levels, then we need to define, do some benchmarking. And this will be a very political process at a global level. So currently, what UIS is doing, we are mapping existing content framework. And to understand basically is to understand the learning domain around country and identify the gaps and the commonalities across all this assessment, so that we have a comprehensive reference frame. Because the initial reference framework is actually developed based on a representative sample of curriculum, and it has been further enriched by looking into the national assessment framework. And because this will be a global content reference frame, so we want to have this frame, the content frame, as wide as possible so that it incorporate all national assessment content in this frame. And also through this mapping, we can identify the content coverage of mathematics at different grade across country. Malcolm, in the next presentation, will talk more about the development of this content frame and the coding scheme. Once we have the content reference frame, then it is used to develop a coding scheme. Why coding scheme? Because we might be using this in the validation process for the assessment of data qualities. As Ursula mentioned this morning, there's a two-step stage in the validation process. One is to align. We have to evaluate the alignment in the content. The second thing is to assess the data collection qualities. So there are two steps to it. And we are basically, this coding scheme fit into the first step of this assessment data quality framework. So in summary, like what I mentioned in the beginning, there are three products through this process or activities. One is the content reference framework that will give us the coverage of mathematics domain. And then we also have a mapping of national assessment framework to help us identify the commonalities and gaps of the domain or construct in the content coverage. The third thing is we're using this to develop coding scheme. And this coding scheme will be used as a tool for assessment of data qualities. Currently, the math framework, the content frame, and the coding scheme is sort of done. I think Malcolm will give you more detail on that. And we're still developing the reading content reference framework. And once the content reference framework is developed, then the coding scheme will follow. And at this point of time, our technical partner, IBE, is actually mapping the database. So they are using the coding scheme to map all the national assessment framework so that we will have the database at the end of this month and end of next month for math and reading respectively. Okay, the next step is for UIS to work with ASA, our technical partner, to further develop this coding scheme. Because we developed the coding scheme is to do the mapping, to understand the commonalities and gaps of content coverage. But in order to use it for a validation process, maybe it needs to be integrated into the process. Until we work out the details, this will be an ongoing work in progress. And then with that, methodology papers and instruction manual will be produced for partners or stakeholders who will be using the coding scheme to help validate the assessment content. If it's well developed, country can even use it to evaluate their own content and see if their coverage of the content is sufficient for the learning of mathematics. So I guess that's it. Thank you. And Malcolm will come to give a presentation of more details regarding the content frameworks and the coding scheme. Thanks.
Briefly, just to introduce Malcolm, who can complete this introduction. Malcolm Cunningham is an adjunct research professor at the Institute of Cognitive Science in Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. And he's going to be talking, as Brenda said, about how to use the content framework for reference to produce a coding scheme, basically focused on mathematics.
Good afternoon. My name is Malcolm, as I've been introduced. I've been interested in education and in learning, particularly mathematics, for some years. Learning, achievement, and ability are issues that are really dear to my heart. I've been involved in designing programs to teach children, as well as analyzing large-scale and small-scale assessments in order to understand what it is we think we're testing when we test for things like mathematics. So what I'm going to do here is to provide you with an outline of the objectives that landed on my lap, because what I would like you to do as I walk through this is to imagine yourself constructing this thing, because I'm going to construct it with you frame by frame, because I want to give you an overview of exactly what it was that I was faced with. The first two objectives, for anybody here who started, I was actually given this in December, were daunting. First one was to develop a common framework for various national learning priorities in mathematics, years 1 to 8. The second objective was to create a coding scheme to map various national assessment frameworks onto that common framework. This is huge, right? Huge. So initially, I negotiated with UIS, and we negotiated a set of principles in order to approach the design of something like this. The first principle is that whatever we design should be theoretically defensible. We should be able to tie whatever it is we create back to some understanding of what mathematical cognition is. It should be practically defensible because the connection with national assessment frameworks themselves being eminently practical, any theoretical model that attempts to impose upon the practicality the assessment frameworks give will be hopelessly lost. So it has to be practically meaningful as well. It has to be flexible. As new theories come over the horizon, because I'm thinking not just of today, I'm thinking about 20 years from now. As new theories come over the horizon, this thing has to be able to adapt to whatever it is they bring. And the same reason, whatever practical changes come in curriculum design, this model should also be adaptable enough to withstand the buffets and the changes. Not only that, whatever it is we create in terms of a coding scheme in the end should be easy for a coder to learn. It should be easy for a coder to modify. And it should be extensible so that in the end, we can adapt it to analyze data. I get ahead of myself there. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Is it? So, I'm going back. Can you bring back? Okay, so it needs to be analyzable. In other words, it needs to be a useful enough tool to extract data from. So what I'm going to propose today is a qualitative approach to a model, and what I'm describing today it's based purely on qualitative research techniques. But in the end, what I want is something that has quantifiable implications, huge quantifiable, because then I believe, and I hope you will agree with me at the end, that we can do this. Here is, I keep on hitting it, here is the work plan. And this is basically an overview of exactly what it is I'm going to talk about. And if you look at the work plan, it comes in more or less 3 pieces. There's the cognitive piece, which is the theoretical piece. There's the reference list, which is the practical piece, and it's going to equate with curriculum. There's the issue of coding, and then there's the national assessment frameworks. And you can see the national assessment frameworks are fitting into the common content framework, almost like, and I don't want to drive this metaphor too far, but almost like protein transcription, right? So if you can think of the coding scheme here as a piece of DNA, then the national assessment frameworks should fit there. And you should be able to extract meaningful information across that boundary. You'll notice that there's discrepancies between the cognitive model and the practical model. Those discrepancies I will address very briefly at the end. They're real, but they're not insurmountable at all. Let's work with the cognitive model first. I'll just speak briefly to that. I'm not going to go into a tirade about cognitive models and mathematics cognition. But I will say this. Since the 1940s, when Polya came out with the earth-shattering work on problem solving, which Alan Schoenfeld picked up in the 1980s and has since, in the 2007 thereabouts, developed a notion about mathematics, what he calls proficiency. There have been a number of descriptions about how children learn and do mathematics. But by and large, those theories are concerned with how people do and learn mathematics in real time. They're not concerned as much with how children learn and do mathematics over the span of a developmental period. And since my mandate was an 8-year time gap, I clearly could not use established cognitive theory to help me to bolster that. Fortunately, Nis and Jensen have recently come up with, Nis, by the way, is, I believe he was a PISA architect for the PISA items, or yes, PISA. And Nis and Jensen's cognitive model stands apart because they bring together the mental attributes of cognition with content, and more importantly, development of content. To give you an idea of what that looks like, can everybody see that? This is just a very brief comparison of Nis and Jensen's cognitive model. You can see that there's a process component and there's a content component. And you can see that the individual, what I'm calling mathematical domains, so number domains, arithmetic, probability, statistics, and so on, they're all mathematics, large domains of knowledge that are recognized in math. Look how they line up with PISA, the test. They line up fairly well. The probability and statistics domains fit well with data management. If you read down, geometry reads down, and algebra and functions fit well with what PISA would define as algebra. So it's looking promising. Now, the problem with cognitive models, even Nis and Jensen's model, is that it's wonderful the way it connects cognitive theory with content and development, but all cognitive theories fail in this respect. They're not detailed enough. And if we're going to develop a coding scheme that will map onto national assessment frameworks, we need details. We need to be swimming in details. None of these theories will give that to us. They're not detailed in content, and they're not detailed in the way the content plays out over a developmental period. So we're talking about the first 8 years of a child's mathematics education, then we're talking about a significant period of development that these theories cannot account for in any kind of detailed way. There it comes now. Now, so this is where curriculum comes in. Curriculum does give you detail. It gives you an ocean's worth of detail. Curriculum is usually designed around the most detailed parts of most curriculum documents I would refer to as learning expectations. You can refer to them as something else, learning outcomes, sometimes they're called as well. But they're detailed descriptions about what children are expected to learn in a finite period of time. So curriculum is detailed, it's great. So the content itself in curriculum is detailed, so you can say that we have detailed learning expectations, that's good. The problem with curriculum, though, is that the curriculum generally takes a child-centered viewpoint. Curriculum tends to take a developmental and a very instructionally focused viewpoint, which skews the way we educators, we among us who are educators, introduce children to new ideas. To give you an example, if we were to deal with, in terms of just purely mathematical entities, we would never teach measurement as a standalone domain because it's not recognized as a mathematical domain. We introduce it in curriculum because it just makes sense. So you'll see in curriculum documents measurement often appearing as its own domain, but in mathematical content documents and many cognitive models, it won't appear. It doesn't mean it's not taught, it just means it's spread among other domains that are not recognized as being measurement in their own. Curriculum's wonderful because it's developmentally organized, and it's been organized as a system of teaching that has stood the test of time within a specific jurisdiction. So we know that the way the curriculum is laid out, there's a developmental kick to all of it. Problem with that is you get variable content, and you go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and you get different interpretations of the same kinds of things, which makes any kind of consistent framework, any global consistent framework, a very difficult challenge to surmount. Nice thing about curriculums is they map right onto national assessment frameworks. If you think about curriculum as a jurisdictional intention to teach and learn, then a national assessment framework can be thought of as a jurisdictional intention to test. It's what a jurisdiction deems important enough to test. And what I'll argue is that the jurisdictional's intentions to teach and learn is always a bigger bucket than a jurisdictional's intentions to test. It's always bigger. So if we develop a framework that is around the curriculum targets, then we have something large enough to fit any single national assessment framework. Stands to reason. Of course, the problem with developing a model like this that's capable of managing any national assessment framework is that we can't just develop a consistent content and process framework that represents all of the world's curriculum. That's an impossible task to accomplish. So instead of doing that, I've gone the opposite way. I collected information and I was sculling all of the curriculum documents that I had in detail to look for similarities and differences. And where differences appeared, I preserved them. To give you a concrete example, in the Guatemalan curriculum documents from 1 to 8, first year to 8 years, there's a huge emphasis on the indigenous culture and how the indigenous cultures maps onto children's conceptions of mathematics, to the point where they have children in elementary school counting in base 20, which I think is amazing, but that only occurs in the Guatemalan curriculum. It doesn't occur, or you don't see it in the Chilean or the Argentinian curriculum. You don't see it certainly you don't see it in European curriculums. So it was preserved as an element in this content framework so that the developing international framework can capture anything that comes through. So the method, and I'll go through this really fast. It was done in 3 stages. It's based on, for those of you who know Glazer's work in the 1960s, the constant comparative method, which is an established qualitative research approach. What I did was that I did it in 3 stages. Stage number 1, I just simply took national curricula and I looked at them, condensed them down into a common 4-dimensional framework, which I created as a provisional framework, and modified the descriptors for that framework, and I'll show you an example of the framework in just a moment, modified those descriptors as more information was plugged in at the detailed learning expectations end. And as I found learning expectations that did not fit my initial provisional one, I adjusted the framework so that they would fit. So it's this developing sort of rolling process of widening it. Then I combined national curricula by language group. And language group, I mean by the English, French, and Spanish language groups. So we were looking at curriculum documents in all 3 language groups. And so the first stage was keeping them separate, and the 3 separate language groups are organized by year. Most curriculum documents provide information about what children should learn by year. Well, that's except for the French ones, because they have learning cycles, and that's every 2 years they go. So the second stage here is to combine that and collapse the yearly view of curriculum that you normally see in school and school-based systems down to just the mathematical domains. So for example, in number and number theory, or number and number knowledge, sorry, we would collapse all 8 years down to that one domain of number and number knowledge. Same thing with algebra. And these items, the detailed information was organized developmentally so that, for example, adding natural numbers preceded adding fractions, say. So it was all developmentally organized. But we got away with we got rid of the yearly designations. The third stage then was to collapse the difference between the language and create, one single framework. I'm going crazy again. Bring back. Can you bring back? Back. One more. Thank you. Okay, so what we have is we have one collapsed reference list, and this collapsed reference list tries to capture the differences as well as the similarities between the three language groups across the domains that you can see here, starting with mathematics ability and working down to algebra. They're the domains in the final reference list across three languages. Now, I do not pretend for one moment that this curriculum framework is representative of national curriculum. It's not. What this is a tool to organize detailed curriculum information that we get from national documents. It's a tool used to map assessment frameworks. That's all. Okay, so the 4 domain, subdomain, construct, subconstruct was the initial framework that I imposed upon it. And so domain level, at the domain level, you'd have like algebra or number knowledge. They would be the domain level things. Subdomain in number knowledge would be, for example, pre-number knowledge, which appears in the Ghanaian curriculum, but nowhere. It doesn't appear in most, for example, in the UK curriculum, I didn't find any pre-number knowledge information about mathematics, but in Ghana, it's an important thing to add in, so it's part of the domain or subdomain in Ghana. Constructs was one level down from that. Constructs involved usually in the number knowledge domain. They would involve things like fractions, natural numbers, etc. And then you keep on drilling down. I'll show you an example in just a moment. Action targets is the most important part of all of this. The framework doesn't matter at all. The framework is just a static thing you fit things into. The action targets are the details from the curriculum that you port into this system. So the details from the curriculum actually are helping to shape the framework, not the other way around. So as I add in more actions, I call them action and target now because the action is the mathematical task. The target is what that task is directed at. So for example, I'm adding natural numbers for sums up to 999 would be the target. Okay, so then what we can do, if you can think way down the road, you could quantify that by comparing national assessment frameworks, adding 2 natural numbers. This national assessment framework has it to 1,000. This one here has it to 999. That has it to 50 at this stage. You could then begin to develop levels of response on that action and have a very nice way of collecting quantitative data. Here's an example, and the details here. This is a tree. It breaks down the domains. So on the left-hand side, there's no pointer here, is it? On the left-hand side, there's domain. You read down. The domains are there. Subdomain, the number systems one is exploded. And the construct is the natural numbers, which is natural numbers are subsumed under number domains, so just a system of numbering. Adding and subtracting natural numbers, which is the subconstruct, and then the actions are listed. So there's 10 actions associated with that one subconstruct. So imagine every one of the branches of that tree exploded out in the same way, and you get some kind of an idea of the level of detail that we're beginning with. To locate a dimension, and this is now, what I've described to you is the creation of the coding scheme. Now I'm going to describe to you the mapping of national assessment frameworks onto the coding scheme. National assessment frameworks, as I mentioned, are jurisdictional intentions to test. And usually when you read a national assessment framework, the author of the national assessment framework will give you some kind of a framework within which national assessment item types are listed. They don't necessarily map onto curriculum domains, as I've mentioned, so I just call them dimensions in the national assessment framework because it's arbitrary. In fact, everything, well, I won't say that much. So the first thing we asked Coder to do was to align the main dimensions of the national assessment framework to the coding scheme that Howard, to the coding scheme, the contents coding scheme, the final reference list. So that the first thing they do is, if arithmetic is there, okay, arithmetic is there. Is algebra there? Okay, algebra is there. Just to orientate the coder where they are. Second thing is, if a dimension, and this happens, maps onto more than one list dimension in the actual coding scheme itself, then the direction to the coder was, well, take that National Assessment Framework dimension and split it into two. And just make note of the fact that it's been divided into two in the framework. In the case where a national dimensions don't map, we ask the coders to add them in. And we ask them to do exactly the same thing with the targeting. So they would take the detailed item type informations from the National Assessment Frameworks then, and they do exactly the same things. They would map them on to the common construct model, and where things did not fit, they would notify us or add them, and we'd add them in. Where they mapped onto more than one, we would indicate that in the final mapping. So what I want to impress upon you is that the coding scheme for coders to map onto this has nothing to do with pejorative language that I have brought into this model. It's actually being driven by the framework and the item types themselves. So I'm not giving coders any horrendous descriptions about what I want them to see and what I don't want them to see. It's there. Here's an example. This is Tanzania. The Tanzanian, and this is a difficult, bear with me, I thought I would have a pointer here to help you. If you read this table from the outer gray area across the top down to the outer gray area, you're going like a bridge, like an inverted U. So you can see in Tanzania where there are 3 subdomains in mathematical proficiency, there is none in the Tanzanian curriculum. Not surprising. There's no, mathematical proficiency is something that most curriculum, most national assessment frameworks do not include because it's very difficult to assess. It's put in there because I believe that they'll become more important in the future. If you take a look at number knowledge, there's 2 subdomains and 7 constructs there. In the Tanzanian National Assessment Framework, you get 3 in 1. So you have an instant way of comparing against if you think of the final reference list as the universe of actions and targets, then a national assessment framework will fit into that universe with a sample of actions and targets based on the National Assessment Framework item design. And you have a way of having a look at, you have a way then of quantifying how, not only how well they fit within the reference framework itself, but what that distribution looks like. Is there a difference between a distribution of national assessment frameworks that are scoring this in, for example, a PISA test against ones that are scoring that in a PISA test? Do they lump together? When you group a whole bunch of them together, do you get recognizable groupings between national assessment frameworks when they map onto this curriculum framework? I don't want to belabor it too much. So here's a concrete example of mapping from a national assessment framework onto the framework. If the National Assessment Framework item type is the ability to add numbers with not more than 3 digits in 4 questions, which is actually one of the things in the Tanzanian curriculum, what the coder would do is link that to the number knowledge domain. It then links naturally to the subdomain number and number systems and natural numbers. And the second dimension in the Tanzanian National Assessment Framework is to add and subtract numbers with not more than 3 digits. That still fits within the construct. And then finally down the bottom here, subconstruct should be adding and subtracting, and the third dimension in the Tanzanian National Assessment Framework fits perfectly in there. The next step, the most important step, then is to map that and find the mate for the National Assessment Framework detailed item type onto the action target group. I'll show you this in a second. Okay, so here's again the same detailed National Assessment Framework item type, ability to add numbers with not more than 3 digits in 4 questions. It maps onto the first example which the coder's given of the action target list associated with that, that location in the common reference list. So the coder then would score that way, and it would go on. If the item type did not appear, it would be notified. We could add it in later. If it pertained to more than one, then we could note that as well. So let me just give you a really brief overview of what you just see. You've seen a cognitive model wrapped, or you've seen an assessment model, a curriculum model wrapped in a cognitive model. And this is where I get, there we go. You see the non-overlaps. The cognitive model, in Nissen Jensen's original description, they described avoiding any kind of child-centered or curriculum-based interpretations of mathematics domains. So they stuck rigorously to mathematical structures as they would be identified by mathematicians. Hence, there's a great big hole beside measurement. That doesn't mean they didn't test measurement or didn't feel it was important to do. They did. It was just distributed among those other ones. The same reason applies to discrete mathematics. Discrete mathematics is a mathematical topic deemed by Nissen Jensen to be important to teach in the first 8 years. But no curriculum designer, no teacher would ever think of giving a topic to children between the first 8 years about discrete mathematics. What they do is they fold it in. So, for example, when children do they design surveys and they analyze surveys about their classmates' height, they're doing discrete math. They're just not calling it discrete math. So these two views map, and they map well. The coding scheme then was developed from that, and as I pointed out, the National Assessment Frameworks came from that. Okay? So let me just tie this up. I pointed out you've been only looking at the domain level stuff up until now. The detail is actually in the documents themselves. Opportunities. So far, there's been reasonably good fit between the National Assessment Framework item types and the coding scheme. I think we're up to 60 National Assessment Frameworks that have fit reasonably well. I'll precede that with the observation that the mapping so far has been done with English language curriculum. I'd be horrified if it didn't fit well. I'll be fascinated to see what happens when they try and do the Spanish language ones. I'll tell you why. The English language documents, and anybody here can, I've raised this a couple of times, and I've got, so far I've got this, because I have no idea. The English language documents separate mathematical process, which is things like reasoning, problem solving, arguing, into its own bucket, process bucket. Spanish language curriculum tend to fold them into the domains themselves, so you get these complicated domain descriptions that include all of the process stuff, and that don't tear away easily. So therefore, the final reference framework doesn't represent an international view of curriculum. It actually is just a way of making sense of these details in math. That's all. We can then, as I said before, use the National Assessment Framework as a universe of item types that we can create a better idea of what a distribution of National Assessment Framework. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way again. Can you bring me back too? One more? Thank you. So it's conceivable we could do comparative studies of curriculum with this tool. It is conceivable we could do comparisons, or we could do National Assessment Framework curriculum mappings, which is what I'm talking about. It's conceivable that you could do comparative views between National Assessment Frameworks. And I'm thinking now, a little bit further down the road, you can actually create a node and link. For those of you who know dendrograms, you could create a node and link view of this whole system that you could analyze them as a mathematical node and link diagram, and then analyze it as a quantifiable thing that way. You could do comparative studies of curriculum, National Assessment Frameworks, and test results. This is referring to the fact that both curriculum and National Assessment Frameworks are intentions to do something, whereas test results are actually what has been done. So it'd be interesting to link those in a path. challenges. There's variability in mathematical focus, as I've mentioned, that cuts across jurisdiction, culture, and language. And some of these may be insurmountable. I hope they're not. Some of them are significant to the point that the coders have had trouble sometimes with locating things on the content framework as a result of the way a jurisdiction identifies where something should fit. There are jurisdictional differences in the way content and skills are described. There's no question about that. There's tension between what can and should be taught as opposed to what can and should be tested. And as just a lead in, and this is looking into the future, if you think about international tests and even national tests, the tendency of tests is to test content because content is easier to test. Mathematical process is harder to test, but every curriculum document in the world, pretty well, is coming to the view that you need to have some indication for your teachers to teach process. The question is, how do you test that? Is it testable? And I believe that with the advent of online instruments, we're actually in a renaissance right now of item test design, because you can ask questions in ways now online you could never ask in a paper and pencil test. And you can gather metadata of the kind, of the breadth and richness, which was inconceivable even 10 years ago. Last point, and I'll say goodbye. The robustness of this coding scheme relies on the robustness of the national assessment frameworks and how many of them were fitting into this, but also on the curriculum side. We need to fit lots of curriculum stuff into this as well, because what I'm looking for is curriculum that doesn't fit more than curriculum necessary that does. Thank you very much.
I'll ask the room for a round of applause for both Brenda and Malcolm. And I think we can open the floor for questions or comments. Yes, Marguerite, and then the colleague from Brazil. Marguerite.
Thank you for those presentations. I came in on the tail end of Brenda's, and also maybe I missed some of what Malcolm said, so forgive me if my questions have already been addressed. But I've got kind of 3 questions that are all basically one question. The first is, I was wondering why you used for Malcolm, I was wondering why you used the PISA framework as a reference and not the TIMSS math framework as a reference when you were laying out the different components of math. Second, the framework you developed for national assessment mapping, it's very heavy on the content side in terms of the topic areas and capturing the topic areas that are covered. I wonder if there would be a way also to flesh out the cognitive demand side or the process angle, because I think if you're just focusing on the content, you're going to miss a lot in terms of the difficulty of different curricula and their related assessments. And then the final part was, there's a lot of reference to national assessment frameworks, but if you look at national assessment framework documents, they tend to be kind of broad in nature in terms of scoping out the general topic areas and cognitive processes to be tested. The rubber really hits the road with the test blueprint, which is where the content by cognitive process mapping happens in a way that weights the different cells in the blueprint according to which topic by cognitive processing elements are perceived as more important. So I think there's also another piece there that you might want to bring into your coding scheme, and I'd just like to have your reactions to that. Thank you.
Alessandro, if you want to pose your question. Yes.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to register the Brazil's We are deeply grateful to UNESCO and for INEE for this invitation. It's always a great opportunity to us for our research institute to learn. It doesn't surprise us, your organization and well-done work here. And I have just, after this acknowledgement of your work, I would like just to make a brief consideration, because during you were explaining, Brenda and Professor explained the National Assessment Framework and who to assess. And of course, we start thinking, we are going to use paper, what kind of test? As you mentioned in your presentation, Professor, and there is always a tension between what we could test and what should be learned. And in this morning, our coordinator, let me get his name properly, David Coleman, I mentioned it about how to translate this wonderful work here. I start thinking about after a couple of years, how people will understand this. For example, the word Global Alliance for Monitoring of Learning. After 2 days of work here, all of us will know that learning, a monitor of learning of some cognitive domains. But how to translate these to the policymakers, to the stakeholders, to the teachers? So in short, just to summarize my point of view, we should make some considerations about how we are going to say, to translate this. Because we know that we are talking about some cognitive domains, but we know that learning is much deeper, it's much further than we could spend all the day long here talk about what is learning. We have social, emotional, physical, many other domains, ethical domains. So, for example, in Brazil, every single hour, almost 600 women are victims of violence. We should think about that in learning. We just put our finger about cognitive domain. It's a serious problem to our policymakers, because when they see that, INEE makes very hard work to explain how complex are these tests and its limitation. But some policymakers, I think, oh, it's wonderful, and I start think, oh, I can do magic with this. So it's just this consideration. I'm sure that we will keep learning so much from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question, and then I'll ask Brenda and Malcolm to address them. Simon?
Thank you. I think this is really addressed to Malcolm. First of all, it's a fascinating presentation, and I think very much appreciated. And I'm going to take my statistician's hat on and put my former teacher's hat on. I taught in I think probably about 5 or 6 different countries over the years. And I think your idea about mapping curriculum is very accurate, and I think you're going to find a lot of commonality, and that's always going to be the case. The challenge when you moved from country to country was never about curriculum. It was always about the philosophy of the teaching in that country. It was always about the philosophy of the assessments. A very simple example, when I moved, I think, from the UK to the US, a 65 in the UK was fantastic, a much more difficult assessment. A 65 in the US is disastrous. So it goes for me back to purpose of instruments, purpose of assessment, and not curriculum, and I think that's probably a much deeper challenge, and I think you mentioned it on the third bullet, intentions. So any thoughts at a later point about how to address that, I think, would be fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take the last, Talia.
Thank you. Thank you again for the presentations. They were really interesting. I have a question about the mapping of the national assessment frameworks that took place. I think if I understood correctly, there were 100 national assessment frameworks that were taken into consideration. And I would be really interested to hear from what countries or where they were coming from, and if there are high-income countries, middle-income, low-income, if there's particular geographies that were represented or left out, and what you think may be the implications of some of the groups that may not be represented in the common framework. Thanks.
And that's a selfless question from GPE, who's not interested to get their hands on the data or anything like that.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions. First of all, the first question. Why PISA versus TIMSS? I could have, honestly, if I had included TIMSS data into this, it probably would not have shifted things too much. It was an arbitrary choice, and I could easily have used TIMSS data, yes. Particularly nowadays, since TIMSS is moving towards justifying their curriculum-based model on a cognitive basis. I agree with you completely. So I really have no issue there. It's heavy on the content side, no question about it. The fact that the mapping that I was asked to do was to map national assessment frameworks onto some sort of common content scheme necessitates that content be front and center simply because that's what children face. It's not now your next question about, your next comment about the importance of the process, I couldn't agree with you more. I could not agree with you more. The issue with process is that, first of all, if we're talking about mathematical cognition, which processes are we actually counting? So, for example, Schoenfeld counts prior beliefs as part of mathematical process. In Nielsen-Jensen's model, they're looking at something completely different. You have some mathematical cognitive sort of theories that look at problem solving. The problem is that all of the things that I could mention are devilishly difficult in any kind of a test format, particularly a standardized test format, to get at. And so what happens, and I'll give you, in Ontario, in Canada, Ontario sees the value of teaching process and lauds encourages teachers to include process kinds of things, gives them all kinds of details how to do it. The problem is that when it comes around to testing it, the testing agency admits that what they're testing and they're capturing is that they'll admit that when they're marking or they're assessing the responses from the standardized test in Ontario, that they admit that process is just sort of part of whatever score the kids get. They can't actually isolate it anywhere. So the answer is I utterly agree with you. I don't know how to do that yet. We don't know how to do that yet, and that goes back to the learning issue. So we don't know how to do that yet. Should we have used test blueprints? Again, absolutely yes. Starting with the national assessment frameworks, you're right, they're broader, but I'd rather work with a blurry landscape and work in the details than work the other way around. Start with the blurry landscape, get broad agreement across the board, then we can fill in the details later if they're fittable. If they're not, then we need to revisit the framework itself. That was the reasonable approach, but I utterly agree with you in terms of the blueprints. Second questioner, how can we translate these issues? to other jurisdictions. You have me there. These things only gain life when people talk about them and do them. That's the only way they gain life. This framework is not proprietary or closed as far as I understand. It's on the website, so anybody can play with it, I think, the way it is, and you can see how it behaves. And actually, so I would suggest that, and I would be delighted to help in any way I can, that the translation issue is actually in the doing. Your comment about learning, again, I have no issue with the comment. It's just that now I have a few ideas about how to measure learning. This isn't the right venue to do that, though. The issue of learning and how to get learning into documents like that, what counts as learning, what doesn't, is a future thing. The third questioner. The challenge is always philosophy of teaching and assessment. Is I'm getting it wrong. I've written. Can you just, Simon? Can you just reiterate? Oh yes. Oh yeah. The philosophy. Okay, Simon. Yes. The overall universe of item type, or the action targets that we have, is a faithful example of the scope and the breadth and the depth of international curriculum attempts. Okay, and it's a faithful reflection of what is important in terms of curriculum in the world, in breadth and scope. What any one nation makes of that by plugging in the coding scheme can be either done nation by nation, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, or it can be done in a global kind of a way. There's no proprietal drive here to have only one definition. It's quite possible that if in the US a 65 is seen as a terrible return on a test, then that could simply be reflected by what's important, what they feel is important in how it fits in the coding scheme. If in the future we can link how well the content maps onto assessment frameworks, and we can then link it to test scores, you have a way of saying, well, I got a test score of this. This is where my assessment framework maps on to the international curriculum. Could I improve something here? Perhaps. So there is a way actually for jurisdictions to address those issues, I think, built into that. Fourth question about mapping the national assessment framework so far. Great point. First of all, let me say, the content framework was designed purposely with one developed country's curriculum basis in each of the 3 language groups. The rest were all developing, purposely done that way, because, and it was my druthers to begin with, at least, to put in more first world curriculum simply because they're incredibly detailed and they're easy to get. Whereas the developing nations, they tend to be more difficult to get. But so the curriculum side, they were developed with the developing nations. The national assessment frameworks that are being tested against the framework are being run by IBE, and everything they've told me so far, it runs from curriculum running from the Common Core curriculum standards in the US to Sri Lanka, and everything in between. So they're not, as far as I know, choosing to select any given sort of area or concern.
I think we have a few more minutes for questions, if there's another round of questions or comments. No? Antonia?
Thanks. I was hesitating because I don't really know how to formulate the question that I have in my head. This was really interesting. And at the same time, I'm wondering whether we, in a really kind of good concern around making sure that we do take national contexts, national curricular policies into account, whether that's actually taking us further from the end goal of why we are here, in the sense that now we're looking at the specifics of national curricula, not necessarily at how indicator 4.1.1 can become a reality, or the links to indicator 4.2.1 on the national assessment systems. And it seems to me that if we're broadening the scope in this way, there's a lot of other questions that would also be very interesting to look at. Say, how do systems deal with the results in tests? What's the mechanisms put into place to actually put in different interventions to help those kids who are not learning? At what different grades do they have these assessments? I could carry on for a long time, because obviously there's lots of interesting questions to explore in relation to assessments. So a kind of, and I don't know even if this is probably not even a question to Malcolm, but more a question to others in the room. Is this helping us, or are we actually risking ending up with, in a way, a distraction, even if it's an important distraction? Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this point? If not, I'd like to ask a question. I think maybe, I don't know if I've understood what Alessandro was asking, but I think maybe there's also the question, not just translating into other languages literally or other jurisdictions, but the question of how to reinterpret these ideas in ways that may be more accessible to policymakers. And I'm going to take a huge risk and say, well, if I try to translate what I just heard and just saw, is the cognitive level of this how we think about math? The reference list, is it how we teach it? Is the national assessment framework how we assess it? And is the coding scheme how we connect the two parts between them? I'm trying to rethink this process in the simplest terms, and then we are actually trying to, on top of all of that, to impose a more global framework to see if there's a correspondence. We know that there won't be an exact correspondence between some of those things, as you said, between the cognitive and the reference list, for instance, because we don't necessarily teach exactly in the way we think, in the exact way we think, supposing that I'm understanding this more or less correctly. But then how does that translate into how it is assessed by each country, and what commonalities there are in those assessment frameworks that reflect those different things? That sort of feeds into Antonia's question about, are we getting closer or farther away from the goal in terms of, well, if we find that there are commonalities, maybe we're getting closer. If we find that there are not, maybe we're getting farther away. And that was a question somehow.
To address the first question. It's my understanding that this thing represents, it's a tool. And its only usefulness is if it encourages reform in areas, places where reform could be beneficial. The tool itself is not designed to provide teachers with advice about how to teach. It's not designed to provide assessors with detailed advice about how to design items for their assessments. But what it does do is it provides an international comparator against which difficult questions, just like the ones you are posing, can be asked. In a vacuum, those questions they have less weight. But if they're within a framework that all of us can wrestle with and agree on, and to be absolutely clear, I'm not married at all to this particular provisional framework. It can change. In fact, I fully expect it will. But the thing is that we have a framework, and it provides us with some groundwork upon which difficult questions can be asked, and then possibly more groundwork can be laid. So I think in the long term, to answer your question, I think reform is in the works there. And if you can see, if we encourage particular jurisdictions to reform their national assessment frameworks to do better, to help their children do better learning and doing mathematics, then I think the teaching and all the other stuff will not be lost on them at all, where those things also need to improve. So it's reform-minded, okay? Second question, how to interpret in terms of for policymakers? We're getting to huge questions here. And from a policy standpoint of view, again, if this tool encourages difficult questions, the same reason among policymakers in a broader scheme, then it will have more than served the time in developing it, because it would have encouraged those kinds of conversations to occur. I can't answer to what common framework and curriculum in mathematics should or should not be taught. I don't think that's my place. I don't think you want me to say that anyways. I can't really answer to what should or should not be tested. What I do know is the curriculum documents represent all of the things that we collectively as humanity inflict upon our children. We decided that this is important for them to learn, and it's important for teachers to teach. The question whether or not that is actually the case, I'll leave up there. I mean, I don't pretend to have an answer to that.
Yes, Brenda?
I want to answer to Talia's questions regarding the mapping. We received a preliminary database from IBE, and actually they had break it down into 7 areas, like how we report in the 7 regions. And in each of the region, we have different national assessment framework. National assessment, not public examinations. And for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we have Seychelles, we have Uganda, some of those different development stage country. So at the end of May, we'll have better pictures, and probably we'll do some analysis and summarize. So you probably will get some information later on. And with reference to Antonio's questions, I have to say, maybe I come from a different perspective. I don't think it's a distraction, because as I presented earlier, when we are looking at national assessment and how it translates into global reporting, there's some tasks need to be present. For example, common language, common terminology, and common definitions. And content reference framework is one of the tool or the products that help us to make sense of all the language, all the terminology is floating around. So that I see as one way to bring us all together, the content reference framework. And of course, content reference framework is not the ends to a mean. It has been used, and we're thinking of developing it, integrating into the assessment of data quality framework. And the coding scheme will help us to try to at least make the step to understand what is out there and how we can use that to align, to do the quality assessment part. But the process, the tool and the process is still under development. There's still a lot of thinking going in. So it's still going to be further developed. So I guess maybe in the next GAML meeting, we'll have more information, and when we work with our technical partner, ASA, more will come out. Marrying the content, the coding scheme, and the UIS reporting skill. The prototype that Junie is going to talk about later on, the learning progression prototype, how those two things will come together at the end, the conceptual part and the content part. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. If there are there any other questions? No? Okay, so we have a coffee break now? Or? Let's break for 15 minutes for coffee. Thank you for your attention.